And one thing while I'm pulling that up that I would just add is we will try, knowing that many people have stacked Zoom calls in this day and age, we're going to try to be done about 10 minutes early at least. So please try to get your questions in early. And we do have a final CTMC webinar for 2020 on the books for November 17th. Is that right, Joy? Like the what to expect from the 2021 CTMC?
Correct, yeah.
All right. All right, so I'm going to share my screen. I think. Oh, here we go. Share my screen. This is even a little meta in that these slides were initially presented in the CTMC in 2017 by Mary Ferrant, who is an excellent trial manager at UCSF, who'd worked on the POINT trial of dual antiplatelet treatment in minor stroke and TIA. And I did a kind of chalk talk about her talk and led a discussion. These are the slides from that discussion for you. This will run about 12 minutes, and then we will move into questions for Ms. Chase.
Some of the things that she wanted to get across, and this is something that has been a theme in the CTMC, but understanding issues with regards to the design and conduct of clinical trials, and think about various models for keeping yourself organized. I mean, this is a little bit of good advice for people in science and academics in general, and how to conduct a strong trial. I think one of the challenges that many of you have as early phase investigators or early stage investigators is that in addition to really being on top of your game with respect to the science, that you are often serving as your own project manager in these early stages in terms of the trial that you're doing. And there is potentially a lot of stuff to think about and a lot of stuff to organize, and project management isn't necessarily a core competency for academic physicians. The idea is really, though, that some of the good foundations of trial management are going to be applicable across large multi-center, multi-continent trials such as POINT, and that thinking of these issues in terms of building out your timelines and your tasks can be really important. Again, a lot of this, some of this stuff falls more into the regulatory aspects in terms of trial management, in terms of site recruitment and things like that. Again, site recruitment and some of those issues, I think, are things to be looking at down the road, but I think getting your own site, your single site trial is a lot of the emphasis of our course, knowing that some of you are working on multi-site trials. But I think this is one of the key slides. This is an odd commodity to manage. It is a clinical endeavor dominated by clinicians, many of whom were trained clinically, but it also is in certain respects a business that you are trying to get to an answer in your trial, and we do love focusing on the science, and many of us, if we are in academia, the whole idea of the business of a trial is something that is, or the business of our personal research enterprise or our department's research enterprise can be something that is a little bit obscure to us and something that we have to learn about. But good science is necessary but not sufficient. So that is, again, something to consider. More and more trials are being done, but at the same time, more and more data is being collected, more and more money is being spent, but things are getting more and more complex. So that is certainly something that you have to keep your eye on, knowing that as there are more regulations and more other trials, sometimes you lose sight of trying to be simple and efficient when you ought to be. Many more trials are recruiting outside the United States again, and that is, that adds to potential complexity with different regulations, different other issues. But I think her argument in her webinar is, management techniques similar to what is used to run successful business projects can be applied to how to manage your trial at any phase, in the design phase or the proposal phase, and certainly in the implementation phase. So this is, a quote, project management is a critical aspect of the clinical trial process whose importance in successful trial execution cannot be overstated. And I'm not going to turn you all into good project managers with our simple office hours today, listening to Mary's talk is not going to make you a great project manager. If you have access to great project managers in the clinical trial space at your institutions, or have a pathway where if you perhaps have a more junior research assistant who can get mentorship from one of the individuals who's had a longer career in managing projects and managing clinical trials, then that can be a tremendous help to you. But this idea of a trial as a project, and a project is a concrete, organized, and temporary endeavor with specific phases designed to produce a unique product, service, or result. And I recently took one of those Getting Things Done seminars. That's the book gives you a system for organizing your tasks. And the temporary nature of a project is something that is sort of a key aspect. It has a defined beginning and end. Now, trials may end early, but there will be some bar by which they end. And again, trying to look at those predetermined goals and objectives. Again, getting to the application phase, getting to the submission to the IRB or FDA phase. This is consuming resources, and a lot of this resources might be you in the early phase. But I think thinking about how you budget your time and you budget your personal bandwidth, can help in terms of thinking of your trial as a project and thinking of yourself sort of as a small business. And you have various constituencies and customers who you need to think about. And and you may have key assets, people who can help you get things organized or work with you to determine how to sequence and inventory what you need to get done. And again, this is this sort of the life cycle approach. You're going to create an idea, come to a submission, it's going to get reviewed, hopefully it's going to get activated. And again, this might be for using local resources or a pilot grant mechanism at your hospital. There can be a compression of some of these steps, but basically this life cycle actually is worthwhile for most types of clinical trial protocols. Again, these phases: getting the project started, planning how to do the execution of the project, and then make sure that project execution is going well, monitoring the performance, and using your resources well. Cost control can be important. If you have, say, a promise from your chair that you can have a year, a research coordinator for a year to help do your study, or 50% of a research coordinator for a year. A lot of planning, you want to have a lot of planning go into that before you're into that time, because if that person is idling and isn't able to be collecting data and contributing to the success of the execution of your project, then that's a cost. You're using that. That individual's time was one of the things that you perhaps negotiated from your chair, and if it's not getting you the data and the project execution you need, then you have a challenge. Now, you also have a challenge at the front end, though, in terms of getting to initiation. You need potentially some resources here to get your project even started and planned. So there has to be a balance if you do have resources for research coordinators, because one of the most key things in clinical trial design is your labor force. Some of it is you, and some of it is going to be potentially people you hire or have access to through your department. So you want to, labor is a precious and expensive resource, including your own time. So again, thinking of these steps and phases. And this is, again, having kind of covered that, and some of us are in this stage of conducting feasibility studies to really get at this idea of what is feasible recruitment, what is a feasible, doable protocol, and what are the bars we're going to set to say that my single center study did meet our bars for feasibility, and we could now start to plot this out to multiple centers. The feasibility can also have different meanings in terms of different phases. If you're planning if you're an investigator and you're thinking about participating in a multi-center trial, you have to think about your own resources. What resources do you have at your site for doing regulatory submissions? Some of that may be reduced now that we have single IRBs for multi-center trials, but still there is regulatory compliance and paperwork that goes with implementing the protocol. But then also, do you have the resources at your site, and will you get the resources from per patient payments potentially to feasibly do a trial at your site? And then on the other end, if you're running a multi-center trial or even your own single center trial, will you feasibly have the resources and patients to get done what you need to get done? Again, this is ideas of study feasibility, site investigator feasibility, how they performed before, and again, is this a disease that you have access to the patients from? So feasibility, there can be various goals. A lot of our course, in terms of the designs we've been doing for you, we've been focusing on the scientific feasibility aspects, but you can't do the science if you don't have the patients and the right team in place where you would be doing the research. This is thinking of this in the multi-center space, but about 15 to 20% of sites never enroll a single patient. There are studies of IRB applications from single center investigator-initiated studies that show that this number is probably similar, that of the research protocols that get submitted, it's probably 15 to 20% are never going to enroll a single patient. So again, if you've done the right homework in advance for the feasibility on multiple ends, like I have the people to do this, I have the time, I have the patients, then you can hopefully not be in this category. But sometimes new treatments develop, or you get into that space, and that is what it is, but it is a potential opportunity cost. So trying to limit your risk of being either a site in a multi-center trial that, and I've done both of these things. I have gotten a protocol approved, and it was so complicated I've never enrolled patients in that study. And as a site in a multi-center trial, because of feasibility and technology issues and contracting issues, I was never able to enroll a single patient in the MR rescue trial at Michigan, not because the protocol was bad, but just I underestimated the amount of time where things got tied up in administrative hassles, and then we didn't have enough time to do the recruitment. So again, try to learn from the wisdom of others and think about things sort of from this perspective of what, coming up with a plan in advance so that you can have as much, that you de-risk things as much as possible for yourself, so that you have a high likelihood of getting people into your protocol and learning from them what you need to do the next study. Again, Gantt charts can be potentially helpful. Many grant submissions now have a spot, particularly for clinical trial submissions, for the study timeline. And the more tasks that you actually put onto that, this planning activity can be useful, because when the grant reviewers are seeing these, if you have a very relatively simple study timeline startup where it's like, I'm going to do regulatory for a few months, and then I'm going to do this for a few months, that's going to be looked at with some degree of thoughtfulness. But then when you're like, I'm going to be doing all of these special tasks, all of these specific tasks at these times, that can give you a leg up, and that can be part of the clinical trials NIH applications in terms of the study timeline. That's a new attachment in that clinical trials section. And again, that's more. Some of this is more, formal project management, and having a good project manager is definitely important for large multi-center trials. Having access to some resources may be less common for you in the early phase, but when you're building out a clinical trial budget, even if it's just at your site, thinking about who is going to be helping you stay organized and get through your tasks. Since oftentimes as clinicians, we're distracted by our clinics, our other clinical issues, the other research papers that we're trying to get out there. So having research team, including a project manager who can help keep the task going, is important. If you don't have that yet, you still want to have some sort of list so you understand where you're making progress and where you might be stalled on things. And sometimes you can delegate things to others, even if you don't have defined research staff. That could it be administrative assistants in your department who you can get to help work on things, your post-award people, pre-award people, other research networks, or your local CTSA. There are potential resources. So I think these ideas, since a lot of times I'm going to have investigator as own trial manager in your early phase stuff, thinking about this from the perspective of what are the essential skills for a trial manager? Effective communication, number one skill. So both working with your staff, if you're lucky enough to have some, but you're always going to be interacting with others, whether it's patients, IRB, your department, your chair. So being effective as a communicator and advocating for the organization and planning you need. Interpersonal skills. Again, recruiting, if you're in a study where you're going to have the resources to have a project manager who's not you, ability, looking at interpersonal skills, being able to recruit this person who can lead a diverse team across various levels of leadership and can go and be a force multiplier for you to help develop the plan and implement it. Experience and organize, played active roles in the management of multiple trials. This is one way where participation on multi-center trials as a site, if you've done your homework and the feasibility is good and you have the right resources to do this, can be extremely helpful to learning how to be a good clinical trial manager, both if you have a coordinator who could be participating alongside you in a multi-center trial that is investigator initiated, then that, to me, participating as the site PI for the Clearer trial at Michigan was really helpful for me, and it was really helpful for Ali, who was the project manager at the time, in terms of learning how to get a protocol implemented. And then being proactive, anticipating potential issues. I think with that, I think those are sort of the main points I wanted to make in terms of sharing from some.
All right, that was the whirlwind of what it's like, both to be, I think, in a fortunate space where you have access to a good clinical trial project manager who has some time and bandwidth to help you with your project, but also thinking of those best principles when you may be starting out and as an academic investigator, maybe working on some of those tasks more with yourself in that role, knowing that it is a role that, unless you were fortunate to have a prior career as a project manager, that you may not really have learned a lot about in college or medical school, since that aspect is typically something that is sort of a soft skill, life skill. Being organized and running a complex team is not something that those sorts of folks are often taught, which is why we are really fortunate to have a professionals who focus on that and focus on keeping us focused so that we can actually move science forward. So with that, I see that there was I think at this point we don't have any open questions, but I have a few questions here in terms of, or just one question starting to pop up there. But I would like to hand it to Marianne just for any reflections and initial things. And then I have a few questions that I can ask if there aren't some from the audience. We do have one question from Dr. Hawk about any online published resources that would be things to potentially point to. I won't answer that on the fly right this second, but we'll put some things into the box. And if other people have things that are potentially timely, don't hesitate to send them to us as a message, and we could potentially post them in the box too. So with that, I will hand it to Marianne. And I also see that Dixie Eklund has also joined and may have some useful points to add in her work, kind of keeping clinical trialists on track. So.
Thanks, Phil. I'll jump in. I actually, one of the things I wanted to say, actually, even to address the question about the resources, oftentimes early in your career, as Will has already said, and he said in this video, physicians tend to act as their own project managers, which, I understand why. It has primarily to do with resources. I would first encourage people to always sort of find a good coordinator who might be able to help them, because they tend to have the right skills because they've been a coordinator and they understand sort of clinical research overall. If you're really looking for reading materials, and I don't know how much you'll, love the reading materials I'm going to say, but you really need to read up, on your IRB policies to understand, at your institution, how things are done and how your IRB works. If you're going to be doing something that might be regulated by the FDA, reading all the regulations that are part of good clinical practice. If you can go to a course on good clinical practice and how to be a good site investigator, that is really, really beneficial, because reading the words is one thing, but actually putting those things into action, it's learning from other people's experience and being able to go to a course and be interactive. If there's also someone within your own institution that is running a multi-center study or even being a site investigator, sitting down and having a conversation with them, or almost more importantly, sitting down and having a conversation with their coordinator or their project manager to understand the nuances, both at your local institution as well as, sort of the more broad, FDA type regulations, I think would be really helpful. What project manager, any do you use?
This is a good question as to whether there, this is sometimes, I think, as a lot of things have become, people have apps, people have websites, different ways of sharing and organizing documents. We've used different things along the way in the clinical trials methodology course. And this is sort of a question, is if you've worked with any tools that you've found, or software packages that you found particularly effective in keeping teams on track.
So I think the most recent thing that we're using is a software called Smartsheet. And this is a web-based service. I think what I like about it is it's very much like Excel. But what I really like about Smartsheet is you can give access to your different sheets that you create to people at other institutions. So when we're running large multi-center studies, so for instance, we're the clinical coordinating center for NeuroNext, and Dixie's team at the University of Iowa is the data coordination center. So for us to be able to share information instead of having to attach an Excel spreadsheet to something or use it in Dropbox, for us to have common materials on Smartsheet where people can access it from multiple institutions, to me is really helpful. I also use that internally with my team because there are ways you can use the software to assign specific people tasks, and they then get those tasks via email, and you can also track when those tasks are completed. So I think that's another really useful way to use Smartsheet. I will say, I'm just saying Smartsheet because it's one we use, but there are multiple different services out there that are web-based. And again, I think that's sort of the way to go, is web-based as opposed to these flat types of programs that you really have to send via email or share via Dropbox.
Yeah, and I think that's an excellent point in terms of one of the aspects of that is the ability to have people see updates and add to their work queues, so to speak, concurrently, so that, I think historically there's been a fair bit of siloing of data. Somebody has got a bunch of stuff saved onto their work laptop, and sometimes in the old days, people had servers, so you could all kind of see the same files. But moving to something that tends to be cloud-based, I think offers a lot of advantages. On the protocol development side, I think it's been a little more tricky. We've at least in terms of the Siren network, in terms of trial proposals and protocols, we have used a lot of cloud-based word processing, like Google Docs, and then which has its pluses and minuses. For a federally funded study for which the IP of the protocol is kind of a public good or resource, like for example the IceCap trial we run of cardiac arrest, we kind of want to make sure that the protocol is visible to the world. But obviously if you're working with a pharmaceutical compounds that is being developed, protocols aren't often published as widely, although we've seen that start to change with some of the COVID vaccine trials and a call for sort of additional transparency in those. But it can be a bit of an uphill battle, and version control is the version control is the devil, and that's one of the advantages of some of these types of software packages. Microsoft Teams, if your institution has it, has the ability to do more cloud-based editing of kind of Word documents and so forth that gets you some more of that concurrence. But there, I think that the bottom line is there isn't really like a killer app. Like you're going to get way more organized if you use this, because you can see that, I mean, companies are literally having billion-dollar IPOs to try to put project management in a box and make everybody more efficient. And it's really more the people and the keeping things organized, and where you're going to find things and where things are going to be reminded. So one of the next questions that we got from the audience, which I think is a good one, and I think is really timely, and I will adjust it slightly. But do you have any recommendations on ways to recruit an excellent project manager, or potentially, I would sort of say, or develop one, if perhaps the type of person you have the funding to recruit front off maybe doesn't have a ton of prior experience?
Yeah, so I think I have to say that's a question I get asked really frequently, sort of how do you identify the right project manager for you? How do you, know when someone's good? I always say that one of the key credentials is you have to like the person. If you're hiring the project manager, you have to be able to communicate well with that person. So I think, whoever is doing the hiring, if you're the physician who's going to be leading a study and you want to have a project manager that works directly for you, you have to like that person, because you have to talk to that person all the time. And you have to recognize that a good project manager is going to be at your door, in your email, on the phone with you, probably more than most people you work with. So I think making sure that you're comfortable going to them and they're comfortable coming to you. I also have found, just with the different physicians I work with at MGH, I'm thinking of one person in particular who said to me, I have a certain personality. I've realized over time, I work well with a very distinct personality. So when I'm looking for a project manager, it may not be someone, that someone down the hall from me would work with, but I have a certain way of communicating with people. So you want to find someone who has a complementary way of communicating. They can read whether it's your moods, whether it's your understanding your schedule, understanding what type of physician you are and what your availability is. You want to have somebody who you develop a cadence with. I think that's probably one of the most important pieces. Anyone can learn, if they have a personality where they like to get into details and organize, color coding. This is why often coordinators are really great at this role, because they're really good at keeping things in order and on track. You want to look for all those qualities. And I think that anything else with project management, the regulations, the experience, the how do I deal with this, everyone learns that over time. No one's sort of born a project manager. No one even learns it in a book. You can't imagine the things that will come up during a clinical trial. Things come up that no one would ever imagine. And until you've lived through it, you kind of don't have the experience. I think you want to make sure you have someone who doesn't just throw up their hands and give up, communicates well with you, and approaches you with problems. I mean, I have to say, what I look for when I'm hiring project managers is someone who will be open in communication with me and tell me when they've messed up, because that's the most important information, because they may have thought that they messed up, and really it might have been the right decision to make. They just aren't sure of themselves. But if someone hides what they've done and you have to uncover it later, it just makes more work for everyone. So I think really looking for someone you communicate well with, who has sort of obsessive compulsive behaviors of color coding and keeping everything in track would do, you do well with that.
And I would just add that part of it you do want to have a balance between information and independence, in that while crucial to know when to loop you in, it is also crucial to know when not to loop you in, and when to figure things out and make some forward progress. One of the things that I talk about when I'm trying to recruit or figure out if people are good candidates, I just tell them that I am a scatterbrained academic, and I have a lot of things on my plate, including I get put on stroke call. I've got to work an overnight shift in the emergency department, but my research needs to continue to go on. And that, if my research isn't successful, I have a lot of options in terms of I can go work more shifts and things like that. Whereas, the success of my research, I want to have people engaged in my success. Like, I really like working with you. I want to keep working with you. And part of the ways we're going to keep working together is if we keep the research program funded over time. So I think that understanding that this is a shared collaboration, and that different strengths. Again, I have scientific ideas. You have bandwidth. These are some of the things that when you're being upfront with people as to whether they'd be a good candidate, knowing you will have substantial independence. I am not, as a PI, going to tell you what to do each day. However, but I am not going to be absent and say every 6 months, hey, tell me how that trial's going. That I'm going to be here to help you kind of get into the weeds on things that we're having a harder time figuring out. But I think one of the areas where sometimes it just can be a little challenging is if we have the junior investigator with the junior research coordinator. And then I think potentially there are development opportunities that you want to make sure that you could consider they have, whether they're, the things for research, clinical research professionals like the ACRP and other, training opportunities they can have to develop, but also the ability, hopefully within the institution, to connect with more senior people in the research staff roles so that they can learn and have some, you know, and sometimes it's like me as a junior PI and me as my study staff, we're like, we don't know what to do, but we know who else we can ask in our institution for, have you run into this problem before? So I think that that's a lot of, I think a lot of that is just how to develop that collaboration. But I think you're right, Marianne, like ask, you know, upfront in terms of thinking if people are going to be people who are good communicators, but people who can think independently, can, but also know when, you know, they may be, you know, kind of in over their, you know, like not maybe in over the heads is wrong, but hitting a wall. I have a great project manager on one of my, my grants who our text messaging vendor blocked our account because they thought we were misusing the terms of service. And she had tried pretty much everything with the standard, you know, the sort of standard processes, and but then sort of came to me, it's like, gosh, they're turning this off, like what do we do? And it's like, you know, I found the dude on Twitter, I found him on LinkedIn and Twitter, who was the, you know, the CEO of the company. And since it was a relatively small company, I'm like, you don't really want to shut down a federally funded research study that's trying to improve hypertension care in Flint, Michigan, do you? And it's like, no, actually, that's not really part of our business model. Let me talk to my customer support people, and it turned out that went away right away. But again, she had tried really hard with the customer support people, but wasn't getting anywhere. So sometimes you know, but I don't think she was going to come up with, you know, private message the CEO on Twitter, but which is fine. Maybe she would. But sometimes those outside the box solutions are helpful. Another question that we see here is, where are good places to post these sorts of positions or promote these sorts of positions? I think that's a really interesting question, because at least at my university, that's all kind of like an HR process, and that I don't have a lot of, I think there's sometimes choices as to which websites and so forth things will go to for promotion. But it does seem like a decent question, particularly for people at smaller institutions.
Yeah, so so what I would say is, I would say always look internally first, to be honest, because you likely have really good coordinators, people who have been in grants administration, people who have been sort of in the administrative part of research or in the patient care part, and they sort of want to get out of patient care and work in project management. So I would always look locally within your institution or a neighboring institution, maybe. Ask people, ask other physicians if they know of people, because sometimes funding ends, right? And you know, you want to say if someone's funding is ending, or someone is leaving your institution and they're looking for a position because they have great employees that they want to, you know, be able to transition to someone else. So look locally first would be my first thing. Second one, I agree with you, Will. I mean, it really does depend on your HR department as to how these things get posted. Also having some type of a career ladder within your institution, which I know, I mean, I just know at MGH, we had a hard time creating career ladders. I know at many of the Neuronext sites, creating a career ladder so that if someone has been a coordinator, sometimes there's a coordinator 1 or 2 level, but there may not be that project manager level. So trying to find out, is that at your institution? And if so, your HR people may have people that they recommend to you, again, from within the institution. The other place we have when we're looking for really experienced people, we've also advertised at some local schools in the area that have, you know, majors sort of in project management, or sometimes in regulatory affairs, or some, you know, some type of clinical research, either certificate programs or undergraduate programs as well.
And you know, one thing, you know, and sometimes there may be additional areas of growth if you're working with somebody, and there are a lot of sometimes even freely available types of course options that universities have put on through some of their open course initiatives. I needed my project manager to sort of gain some additional skills in the area of data management, because I didn't really have I didn't have the need to have a full-time data manager, And we didn't have a lot of great resources for that investigator-initiated study in terms of having a piece of a data manager. So in that case, elected to have her, as we were in our build-up phase, do some coursework on data management from the perspective of data managers, knowing that, that certainly for large and multi-center clinical trials, people from that professional class are really who you want working on doing that. But then when you are, whether it's working to set up a REDCap database and so forth, having your project manager spend 20 hours going through some data management coursework and philosophy to get that sense of things is, as opposed to spending 20 hours creating a REDCap database that after it's created, you may have a really tough time analyzing because of some of the quirks that went into it. So learning some of the basic principles and trying to apply them. And I think a lot of that goes to some of the things that were in Mary's slides of clinical trials are becoming more and more complex. But if you make your data collection even extra complex, then you're really setting yourself up for some problems later. So doing that planning work in advance and thinking about making every data point count, but also making them more valid in terms of how they're going to come out of patients, how they're going to be collected, or how they're coming out of health records is important. I didn't want to completely sidetrack Dixie if there was anything she wanted to add. Now she doesn't have to, but if there's anything that upon this that she's reflected on that we're missing, I would certainly welcome her to unmute if she wishes. I know that she is not generally shy.
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Yep. Okay. I appreciate the shout out to the data management skills, because I think that's something that often is overlooked. One thing I was thinking about when you're talking about hiring project management is what's opened up now with COVID and remote work. At a place like University of Iowa, where there is no neighboring institution and there is, there's coordinators, and we certainly look within for project management people. But to me, that has opened up, depending on what kind of project you're looking at, but something multi-center, I think that has opened up a whole new world now of how those skills should be assessed and who is the right person for the project, especially if it's a multi-center project that you're looking for.
Good point.
So then a question that I think is near and dear to my heart for both of you, what would you say are some common pitfalls that you see amongst newer investigators that kind of run across a theme of, like I can sort of say, like, what would 2020 Will want to tell 2010 Will? So I think thinking of those things, what are some recurring themes you see as people enter the clinical trial space, that the sort of messages that their future selves would want to tell them now?
So I think that's a great question, a pretty broad question. So I'll try to give some examples, and I know, Dixie, you have some as well. So first of all, I think, when the first thing you really need to start a clinical trial is you need to find some funding, right? So you need to have those questions, you need to have all those, you have to have thought out what you want to do. You need to get funding. When you apply for funding, you should put in a project manager. You should always budget for what you need, because first of all, it's going to make your grant look better and make anybody reviewing your grant understand that you realize you're not going to do this on your own and you need resources, whether it's single center or multi-center. I think the other piece is if you are doing a multi-center study, you have to recognize that the way things are done at your institution is really specific to your institution. You may think of standard of care is the same everywhere, but we have seen time and time again in multi-center studies that the PI who's leading the study assumes that everyone has a clinic that's set up the way they have set up their clinic, that their local pharmacy works the same way, that their IRB works the same way, that they can get access, they're contracting. all of those pieces. It's completely different at a completely different institution. So if you're planning a multi-center study, you really need to talk to your peers out there to find out how are things that they're, how do you typically treat this type of patient? Are these the other drugs that they're on, you know, concomitant medications? You know, we really need to understand the broader field and not base a study specifically on the clinical care that happens at your institution. And the third thing I'll say, and then I'll give Dixie a chance to say, you know, some piece as well, is everything is going to take longer than you plan for, especially before you have a project manager assigned, because you have to understand that no one else at your institution or at the other sites you might be working with has your study as their only focus. So it may be your primary focus, but you have to recognize that it may take someone a week to get back to you, or maybe a month to get back to you. Whether it's your statistician, whether it's other physicians that you're asking for input, whether it's your IRB, the FDA, there are so many other people, you know, people doing contracts. It's not your study is not their only priority. So you need to budget for additional time, not just sort of your own. And then I'll open it up to Dixie. I'm sure you have some comments as well.
Well, the things I think about are make sure you're offering educational opportunities and staff development opportunities. And those can come in a variety of different ways. And because, you know, they, you know, folks will learn very well within their institution, but, you know, if that's broadened to different ways of approaching and thinking about how to tackle a problem, that's only going to help your overall research portfolio. We actually build into our budgets staff development dollars at a, you know, so many $100 per FTE or something like, you know, we have kind of a standard thing, and that's pretty well received. Because often that's the case where, you know, there's opportunities for physicians to go to all kinds of conferences but nobody has any money available, and project managers or coordinators feel like they're kind of begging at the trough to get an opportunity to go to, you know, AAN or, you know, ASAP or whatever kind of meeting is being held. So, and encourage folks to get involved in, you know, poster submissions. Society for Clinical Trials is another good place where some of those opportunities can be offered to people. So I think, and then, you know, always recognizing that, I mean, I think there's a lot of models where physicians are like, you know, well, this person does everything for me and they know everything, which honestly, sometimes it can almost be a little condescending, but other times it can be viewed as recognition of, you know, what the effort and work is that people are doing. So I think that's a fine line between working closely with a coordinator, a project manager, whoever is helping you, you know, and as Marianne spoke in the beginning, as long as you're, you know, all working towards the same goal, people get really passionate about this stuff and, you know, will do their heart and soul you know, to make sure that the project's successful. And I think, and especially, you know, if they're interacting with patients on top of that, or, you know, on some level, that can lead to long-term relationships and really lead to the success of your research portfolio.
One thing that I think resonated in terms of the first thing that Marianne was talking about, in terms of understanding that some processes take longer than they should, you know, things that get tied up in contracting, things that might need to go to FDA and your IRB, other things like that. And I think that's one of the things when sitting down at the beginning and kind of mapping out all the steps that are going to happen, and really try to pick out those steps, that what can happen in parallel and what has to be sequential, knowing that you're not in control of some of those sequential processes, because then you're like, oh, we need to finish the consent form because we can't turn it into the FDA till the consent form's done. And if the consent form isn't done, then I can't, you know, if it doesn't go to the FDA, I can't go to the IRB. And then all of a sudden you're like, oh, gosh, usually I just do the consent form like the last thing. And you're like, no, that needs to be the first thing. And, you know, kind of similar to what you will learn about grant, if you're doing a grant for a clinical trial, really the first thing you need is the budget. like, because that's the hardest thing that's going to need the most tweaking. But you can't have the budget until you have the sample size, which also is one of the most scientifically hard things to come up with first. So those are two things that often you just really have to be like, the budget is sequential from the sample size, and the sample size requires quite a bit of thinking and collaboration with your biostatistical colleagues in many cases. So trying to call out and think about what are the sequential processes and what are the parallel processes, and what are the things that you can be kind of filling out and doing while you're waiting for some other stuff to come in. So it takes experience, but I think with the right sort of mentorship and collaboration, often go there. So we're coming up at my sort of targeted idea of trying to get us done by 12:50, so that people have time to stretch and do something before a 1 o'clock call. But I would hand it, I can give a few kind of key take-home points, but first I just wanted to hand it back to Marianne and Dixie to just give any other sort of closing thoughts. And they might actually come up with the ones that I was going to come up with, which would be fine. But
well, I think there's a lot of closing thoughts to go around. So I think I think what the most important thing is for you to remember to hire a project manager, to get someone who has some experience in research, who you communicate well with. And then, as I thought, and Dixie's point really was a great one, help and plan for that person and budget for that person to have continuing education. And I think the other point that Will brought up was, making sure that, you have someone that has worked within your institution, that is really helpful, right? Because they'll understand your institutional processes. If you get somebody who doesn't have experience, you have to budget for them to have time to go and meet with your IRP, go and meet with your contact people, really get to know your GCRC, or, get to know the different groups within your institution, because it'll be so much better when they have to, request something from one of those groups if they've already made a personal contact with them. So that's one of the things about a project manager. You need somebody who gets along with everybody and will reach out and be the one to sort of put that olive leaf out there and just start getting to know people. And it's, part of that is those soft skills of sort of personality and making sure that you recognize what everybody's job is so that you can go to the right person and not waste anyone's time. So that would be one of my key take homes. Pass to Dixie.
I think you nailed them all.
yeah.
And a good sense of humor too, right?
Yeah.
No, and I think a good point is if things are covered, sometimes we can be respectful of people's time and move on. There was one additional question. I sort of feel like the goalie at the end of a soccer match, like, 3 minutes of injury time. But it's such a good question that I did want to just briefly touch on it, because I don't know the answer, and I don't know but ways that we can make our teams feel valued when working remotely in this. I think that's sort of like a global answer to how do we action, knowing that sometimes us in the clinical world, we do have ongoing responsibilities. So we continue to go in and have those opportunities to be around our professional colleagues, but some of our research staff may be more remote in a more permanent way or semi-permanent way. But how do we keep making sure that our teams feel valued in that setting?
I think it's a great question, very timely question. I can say at MGH, we're out through June of next year at least. So we're having these exact struggles. So I think some of the things we've actually tried to have small group meetings and talk about some of the, this is going to sound strange, but some of the benefits that we've gotten from working remotely. One is that we've gotten to know each other in a very different way. We know each other's pets. We know each other's spouses, children, neighbors, sometimes, depending on, sort of, you get to see somebody's space. So you get to learn a little bit something different about your team members. And also, I think giving people that space to be like, that's my dog barking, or there's work outside my house, or my kid's screaming right now, I just need to mute myself for the next 5 minutes, and giving everyone the space to do that. And actually you as the leader of the group also doing those exact things and saying like, yeah, I'm having it one of those days too. I just can't get out of my sweats, or, lowering those barriers so people know that's okay. And, I mean, I think it's just so hard. We try to also end meetings like Will is trying to do, like end meetings a little bit early so people have time to stretch in between, allow for the first 5 minutes of a meeting for people to kind of trickle in. Those are the types of things we're trying to do. Dixie, any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think, I mean, I think of the famous example we have where one of my folks went as an on-site monitor and met with an investigator and coordinator she'd been working with for a year. And when went to meet them together, the investigator introduced himself to the coordinator and said, "Oh, nice to meet you." So that is not the model you want to go for. And that's even more so important with the remote working environment. So all of those touch points and ways that you can try to, make sure, that people are connected. And webcams to me are like absolutely essential. You got to get people so that they can see each other.
Yeah, good points.
That was one of the things that we built into the clinical trials methodology course even back in 2013 was getting people on the webcams. So thank you so much, Marianne and Dixie, for your thoughts and insights. I think these will be really helpful to people at any stage as they build their research programs. My 3 takeaways I put in the chat box here: make a plan early, find people for your team who can collaborate and work independently, and find mentors and professional development opportunities for your research staff. And with that, I yield the floor to Joy, who has the link there to evaluate the webinar. So please fill that out. Know that you can get CME with that. And I will yield 5 minutes and 30 seconds.
Oh, and I just wanted to mention, thank you to Marianne and Dixie for joining us today, but also that we do have another webinar coming up next Tuesday on November 3rd. So I'll get that announcement out later today. But
Sorry.
yeah, so another one.
I forgot about that one.
Week.
Thank you for fact checking me at the beginning. All right.
All right, thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.